All right. Welcome to This Week in Africa, a collaboration between African Stream and Authentic African, where we break down the top news stories from this week and from the people who've actually reported them. We're going to talk about one major story today, which is how Rwanda has been and is stabilizing the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll also be discussing 1 year anniversary of the war in Sudan with a special guest. And then lastly, we'll be talking about Gaddafi and the West. But before we do, we can start with introductions. I will kick it off to my co-host to introduce herself before I do my own introduction.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for having me on again. My name is Inem Richardson, and I am an African Stream journalist. I am based out of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And so, yeah, I'm excited to be on. This is, I think, the third episode that we're doing together.
It is. And I'm excited to share these stories with you all. And I am Joe Hatagwa. I run a platform called Authentic African. The idea is to bring or bridge the gap between Africans living on the continent and Africans in the diaspora, with the mission of sharing Pan-African news, culture, history, and politics. And so with that, I think we can jump into today's stories. The first of which is, as I mentioned, how Rwanda is destabilizing the DRC. Really, we want to start with a historical look. And this is really the genocide in Rwanda. If any of you are familiar with the film Hotel Rwanda, which Don Cheadle was in, very well received. And even though a fictional story, I think it spoke to, in general, what was happening at the time. Today we want to talk about how that particular conflict that was depicted in that movie has helped to destabilize the DRC. So before we jump into a video on that, let me give you a little bit of background. So it's been 30 years since the Rwandan genocide, but that grim episode in the country's history is still having devastating consequences to this day. In particular, neighboring DRC, where conflict, atrocities, and civilian displacement are facts of life, we examine how, or African Stream examines how, the current instability in Eastern Congo can be traced back to the genocide across the border. So with that, let's jump into this film and then we will react to it, or jump into this video and we will react to it.
The DRC, with around $24 trillion in mineral resources, is undergoing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Since the 90s, more than 6 million people have been killed and another 7 million turned into refugees, including hundreds of thousands in recent months. More than 120 armed groups roam the country, profiting from extortion, trafficking, and illegal mining. The roots of this catastrophe lie in the 1994 Rwanda genocide, which saw 800,000 civilians, mostly Tutsis, but also many Hutus, killed, with France backing the Hutu side and the US and Britain the Tutsis. Around 2 million Rwandan Hutus poured into the DRC in 1994, fearing reprisals from the new Rwandan administration under Paul Kagame. This came in the form of the AFDL, a coalition of Congolese, Rwandan, and other fighters, backed by Rwanda and Uganda. The stated goals were to return those responsible for the genocide back to Rwanda to face justice. According to a 2010 UN report, the AFDL killed tens of thousands of civilians, mainly Congolese Hutus and Rwandan Hutu refugees. The AFDL marched across the country, reaching Kinshasa and overthrowing longtime dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. This was the first Congo War. The Second Congo War followed in 1998, killing millions through combat, disease, and malnutrition. This was triggered by the removal of DRC's Chief of Staff, James Kabarebe, a Rwandan with close links to Kagame. The DRC was also accused of supporting remnant genocide forces such as the Army for the Liberation of Rwanda, ALIR. After 5 long years, the war ended with the 2002 Pretoria Accord. Rwanda, however, still insists Congo harbors genocidal elements, now operating as FDLR, the so-called Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda. The resurgence of the majority Tutsi M23 rebel group in 2021 marked another spike in violence in the DRC. The M23 accused the DRC government of reneging on their promises, such as the incorporation of the M23 into DRC's military and protection of Congo's Tutsi population. The Congolese government, for its part, regards the M23 as a Rwandan proxy, an accusation Kigali denies. Since then, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, homes and farms destroyed across towns like Masisi and Rutshuru, and thousands have been killed. In the midst of this chaos, the numerous armed groups continue profiteering off Congolese resources, sometimes mined using forced and child labor and ending up in the inventories of some of the biggest multinational corporations. Overall, the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide played a significant role in shaping the dynamics of conflict in the DRC and proved lucrative for the Western-dominated global economy.
Wow, so that was a very, very in-depth look at how the tragedy that happened in Rwanda led to, what is happening today. I was unaware of any of those details, specifically the M23 group being majority Tutsi, and that is, I guess where they're saying the connection is to Paul Kagami. And I know we'll touch on that in a moment. But just speaking specifically to the conflict in Rwanda and how that led to some of the challenges and the conflicts in the Congo, I'd love to hear from you, Inem, what your thoughts are on kind of how a conflict in one country and the displacement of those folks have led to some of what we're looking at today. I mean, directly linked to some of the devices that we all own and love, right? So yeah, can you speak to your thoughts on that and what you see there?
Okay, well, I think the video we just watched is super important. For one, I think, I hear a lot of people say that they have a hard time understanding exactly what's going on in the DRC. What exactly is this conflict? Where did it come from? It's like, I feel like a lot of times when we see these sorts of conflicts happening in Africa, the way it's covered in the media is just like, it's so complex. We can't wrap our head around it. We don't know what the roots are. We can't, work it out. And so it ends up being something that's very hard to get people to like organize around or to work in favor of, in this case, like the liberation of the DRC. So I really think this video is really important for being a primer that gives some actual historical context to what's going on. I think it also, does dispel a lot of mythology a little bit around the Rwandan genocide. I mean, the way I was taught to think about the Rwandan genocide was that it was this super tragic thing that happened in the past. It was decontextualized from colonialism and imperialism, but it was this thing that happened, and then Rwanda triumphed. They overcame it, and it's over and it's done. But we can really see that it actually wasn't. That's not how things played out. I mean, a lot of the video shows that it's actually largely exported into the DRC. And so we see like some of the same, or not the same, but very similar dynamics and, a very similar sort of trajectory that has just kind of continued, but outside of Rwanda's borders, but still with Rwandan complicity in what's going on. And, there's other things that I want to say to give more context, but I think maybe, I'll wait for the second video. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you made great points there. I think one of the things that I think was a little bit unclear to me when I first became aware of the Rwandan genocide was that the two different groups were backed by Western parts, right? So you had the British and the US on one side, and then you had France on the other side. I was not aware of that. I think the way it was taught to me was that this was a conflict amongst two tribes in Rwanda, and not at all having to do with other groups backing those groups. And I think this video obviously contextualized that for us. So I think it was really important, as you mentioned. So on that note, I think it makes sense to kind of go into the next topic. I saw some people actually asking, could you please discuss Paul Kagami's role in this? And I think this is really important, right? Because we had touched on this during the last live that we did. So I'll kind of give you guys some background, and then we'll jump into a video that speaks to this. So, and we're going to title this section, Kagami denies backing M23, but the UN actually has a report that says otherwise. So in the week commemorating 3 decades since the genocide that has had over 800,000 people experience loss of life, mostly Hutu and Tutsis, Rwanda's Paul Kagami had denied his country is backing the M23 rebel group, which is formed of ethnic Tutsis and is fighting in the neighboring DRC. So I mentioned Obviously, in 1994, a large number of people are displaced. Many of them have been there since then, and you have a large group of folks now joining the M23. However, a UN report released in December 2023 cast serious doubt on Kagami's narrative. It presented strong evidence that M23, in fact, enjoy the support of Rwanda's military. A recent flare-up in violence in DR Congo's east has seen hundreds of thousands displaced as the rebel group made inroads. The instability has been lucrative to the dozens of armed groups operating in the country who profit from activities like illegal mining, human trafficking, use of child labor, and the resource-rich country. So let's have a watch and let me know your verdict. So let's jump to this video now that discusses the UN's report.
Denies the M23 rebel group active in DRC is a Rwandan proxy.
Why are we being accused as Rwanda of supporting M23? And I'm saying even those who accuse us, actually I should accuse them of not supporting M23 because it is as if they agree with the injustice that is being done to this community.
But a recent UN report on DRC begs to differ. It provides evidence M23 used a military academy located in Gako, Rwanda, in June 2023. Aerial footage also points to direct Rwandan army intervention in DRC's Masisi, Rutshuru, and Nyiragongo regions. Testimony from surrendered M23 and ex-RDF fighters, as well as regional troops, also confirms Rwanda's presence. The UN says RDF soldiers from 5 different battalions have been deployed in DRC since October. Wounded and killed RDF soldiers were transported by road to Rwanda after ambushes in Virunga National Park and bombardments by DRC's military. High-tech weaponry not used by DRC's army has also turned up in East Congo recently. An unexploded guided mortar shell was recovered in Masisi in June last year. In October, remnants of a similar weapon were recovered from a DRC army camp in Kamanyahoro, which had been shelled from alleged RDF control positions earlier in the day. The shells contain laser and GPS components, providing precision strike capability and high lethality. A surface-to-air missile system was also spotted in DRC by a UN drone. So, given the UN's evidence, do you believe Kagame, or is Rwanda destabilizing DRC by backing M23?
Wow. So obviously, now the UN is a group that many people can dispute. They, some people believe some of the things they say, some people don't. Some people have issues with whether or not they're a governing body that should allow more folks in, or have the teeth to be able to make any decisions once they decide on something. And you've seen some recent issues with them and what's going on with Palestine and Israel, really Israel, and his occupation of Palestine. And so, but this report does conflict with what has been discussed or what has been asserted by the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. So on that note, I know that you mentioned that you wanted to reserve some of your comments for after this video since it gave more context. Can you give your thoughts here now that we've gotten another video with more context and what seems like proof of the connection between these two groups?
Sure. I mean, there's so much evidence, as we've just seen, of Paul Kagame and the Rwandan state backing and providing various forms of material support to M23. So I mean, the evidence is out there. I think it's upsetting for a lot of people, and I think it may even be confusing for a lot of people hearing this on a Pan-African channel. So I think it's worth it to really explain. I've done multiple interviews with African Stream, of people who are based out of the DRC, who are from even Goma in Eastern Congo, in North Kivu, and other parts of the country. And, they have been very clear with me that, yes, based off of, the evidence and what they see on the ground, they strongly believe that, yes, Kagame is giving clear material support to M23, but at the same time, they also understand that this is a Pan-African struggle. So we're not saying that we're against the Rwandan people. But I do think we have to be honest about the Rwandan state. We have to be honest about Kagame, and we have to recognize that African countries can serve as sub-imperialist powers, or can, betray the countries around them. For example, I am Nigerian doesn't mean that I agree with all of Nigerian states' foreign policy. I have major issues with some of the foreign policy decisions that the Nigerian state has made, especially in recent times regarding Niger. So that doesn't mean that I have anything against the Nigerian people. We see this kind of dynamic across the continent. It does happen that, African states and African leaders do not always act in the best interest of the African majority across the continent. And I think, we just have so much evidence that this is what's going on in the dynamic between Rwanda and the DRC. And so in order for both the people of Rwanda and the DRC to be part of this larger, Pan-African project and Pan-African struggle, we do need to address, with the evidence that we have, what is going on between the Rwandan state and how that's impacting civilians who do live in Congo.
Absolutely. And I think I think it's also important to just add that, I think there's some questions in the chat around the validity of the folks on this live talking about these particular stories. So, as Ina mentioned, she has interviewed on behalf of African Stream folks in the country. But as you guys can all imagine, right, this is us giving you the facts on the ground, what we're hearing from folks and what we know to be the case, right? From extensive reporting that's happened, not only by African Stream, but by others, and corroborating evidence, et cetera. I think it's also important to note that you don't have to actually be from a country to be able to report on a country, right? As you guys might imagine, many times people are reporting on things that they are not even there, right? They talk to people on the ground, they get the information from the folks on the ground. And I think a lot of times that helps to remove some of the biases, right? If you're actually somebody who's grown up, especially if you're from a particular tribe, it's hard to remove your bias from the particular story that is being reported on. So I think if you want a neutral source and a well-resourced source, then African Stream has that, and particularly INEM in this case. So I just thought I'd mention that because there are some questions in the chat, and I just thought it'd be good to address those. Now, with that, I'll also say, the more that I learn from African Stream, I think the more I have been disappointed with what I'm hearing about what has been happening in terms of how Rwanda has been a part. And the words directly coming from, Paul Kagami, right? I mean, we talked about it last week when he kind of said, okay, I'm hearing that there are, there's illegal mining, there's illegal transfer of these goods, and legal through my country. Why blame us? Why not blame the folks in the end who are actually taking full advantage of this? This is folks in the West, folks in Australia, et cetera. And to me, I think, it's pretty clear that Rwanda is playing a major role in this, and clearly based on what he himself said, right? You don't even need to listen to third parties. You have the source himself saying it. So, we can just report on what he said, right? He basically said, yes, it's happening. It's not my fault. That was what he said in essence. So, for those of us who've been looking at him, I mean, I hate to use this example of the Mount Rushmore of African leaders, but there was a point in time where I had seen him as top 4, top 5, whatever we'll say if we don't want to use Mount Rushmore anymore, but like you want to say top 5 African leaders in history, he was one of those folks. And I think what's happening now is folks will be thinking differently, and it may be hard to change that programming if you've been, for over 20 something years, you've been seeing this person as a force for changing the continent, but now you're finding out that he's had a significant role in probably the most resource-rich country in the world, right? And the stripping of the resources and the constant genocide or continuous genocide is happening there. It was a lot, but I just had to make that point. I don't know, Inem, if you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, that's a good point. I wanted to talk about the video from last week too, because like you said, he himself admits it. And then there's this one thing he says that I think is really interesting. he basically says that yes, Congolese resources are being smuggled, and he names a bunch of countries, that are receiving Congolese resources through, and he's saying, they're being smuggled through Rwanda. And then one thing he says that's really interesting is like, well, what do you want me to do about it? Like, do you want us to stop it? Because you'll be mad at us if we stop it too, and then you'll be speaking, you'll come back and basically, be whining the resources aren't coming. And I think that's just an interesting thing that he says, because for one, like you said, he admits that, the Congolese resources are trickling into Rwanda, then being distributed worldwide. But then it's like this question that he raises, which is like, who is he answering to? He says, you don't want me to actually stop it, because then you'll start complaining. Who are those people that will complain? Who does he respond to? Is he answering to the people of the DRC, the people of the African continent, or does he feel that he has to, offer a response to these Western states or these, industrialized superpower states that are benefiting from Congolese resources? Right. I think it's very interesting, just who he addresses himself to in the video.
Absolutely. And I like that the video at the end did show some logos, very popular logos, to help us understand where these resources end up, right? We know about this, this about the continent of Africa. We have raw resources here. They get refined, if you will, when they go elsewhere. Crude oil, cobalt, many other minerals, right, that come from the earth end up in other places. And Tesla, Apple, Samsung, right, the devices that I'm talking to you on right now, that we utilize in our everyday in our everyday lives, that power vehicles and things like that. So, to that question, right, who does he report to, right? And it seems as though when the fact that he said, you will be upset with me if I stop this, is who will be upset? Apple, Tesla, other countries, maybe, not just companies. But who wouldn't be upset is the people who are supposed to be his constituency and the neighboring country, right? I think that would be where the focus should be, not elsewhere. And so that's why I think this is an important conversation to have, because I think for many of us, we have to be reprogrammed to understand what's actually happening, and we were given false information prior to this last couple of weeks, at least for me. Okay, with that, I think we can move on to stories from around the web. We thought it was important to touch on that, and I'm glad, I see some engagement here, and folks are finding this helpful and a little bit more easy to understand. There's a lot going on. It's multi-layer, and so we'll do our best to try to break these things down for everyone so that it makes it a little bit easier and clearer to understand. Now, with that, we'll move on to stories from around the continent, or headlines from around the continent. And specifically, I think what we want to touch on is Sudan. You guys might remember a year ago or so, a lot of people were posting on their social media platforms, pray for Sudan, right? And it kind of became popular to say that, but we didn't know what was actually going on. And so we want to try to use this live to try to help people understand the complexities and what's actually happening there. So with that, I will just start by kind of giving you a little bit of a background. So Sudan's civil war is nearing the 1-year mark, but not only does the conflict look nowhere near ending, it's failed to evoke global concern, except for like the first couple of weeks, right, where people were posting it online. Today actually marks 1 year since the start of the bloody conflict between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces over who can control Africa's third largest country, Sudan. Very few English-speaking media outlets are shining a spotlight on Sudan's catastrophic humanitarian situation, which has had between 13 and 15,000 people experience loss of life and over 33,000 people injured. However, those numbers are believed to be seriously underestimated. Some people think that those numbers are in the like hundreds of thousands. And this is a disaster for millions of displaced people on the brink of hunger and emergency. And aid agencies have been trying to raise funds to meet the urgent need for food, shelter, and medicines. But so far, only half of what they judge essential has been raised. So they're having a hard time raising the funds and actually getting these, critical aid into the country. It's one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history. 1 year on, why has the Sudanese people's suffering failed to move the world? So let's jump into a video that kind of gives you a little bit of background and kind of gives us a reminder, and then we'll bring on a special guest to talk about it a little bit
have been forgotten.
في المعسكر ده بعاني من اللي بياكلوا ما لاقينه عظيم مصايمين يعني اللي بياكلوا كده في خشومهم ما عندهم يعني بيشربوها مويه بيضاء من جه رمضان ده.
The country faces shortages of food and medicine.
دنيا رمضان نحن دايرين دعم تجينا الأولاد جعانين ما في أكل ما في شراب ما في لبس يعني ما قادرين ما عرفنا الفاهم شنو يقول لنا المنظمة جايكم لكن ما جاني أي شيء.
Conditions at camps for Sudanese fleeing violence are dire, with outbreaks of diseases and insufficient facilities. Sudan's humanitarian crisis is one of the worst in recent history. Nearly 8 million have been displaced, around 1.8 million fled to neighboring countries. UN agencies say they need $4.1 billion in aid, but less than half has been raised. And with access to the country for 8 trucks limited, the situation is worsening. The UN is urging immediate attention to the crisis in Sudan.
All right, so that was obviously, heart-wrenching and the numbers, 4.1 billion is needed, and from the original reading that I had done, less than half of that has been raised. So you can see that there's a lot of work to be done. So we've kind of given you the background. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, and then eventually we'll try to get to some solutions. But before we do that, I think for this particular story, I'd like to bring in African Stream's editor-in-chief, Ahmed Kabalo, himself, who is Sudanese. You guys have been asking for folks who are from the countries that we're talking about. We'd like for him to lay out the true extent of this crisis and explain how severe the difficulties are in getting aid to assist in this. And so I'd like to bring him on to maybe give a little bit more context and his knowledge of the story itself. So first of all, welcome, Ahmed. Thanks for joining the stream.
Thank you. I was just driving back from the office to get back in time, and I was watching the stream before I came on, and I'll just say it was just the presentation that you guys did regarding what's going on in Congo and Rwanda as well was brilliant, really brilliant. I think what's good about the presentation is sometimes people's ego won't allow them to express that actually, I used to think Kagami was a great person. I didn't know much about this. I didn't know much about that. And I think that type of vulnerability allows other people as well to be open to learning, because, we're not, no one is born out the womb as an expert on anything. And what we try to do with African Stream, especially the format with the short videos, is try to make the content digestible and understandable so that we can reach as many people as possible. And the way that you guys broke it down was really fantastic. And I think even though you've done this topic again, because it's such a big topic, you definitely need to cover this again and again and again. Now, with regards to Sudan, another big topic, very important topic. I think much like the Congo, whenever people talk about the Sudan crisis, they always start with kind of the humanitarian situation and people losing their lives. Of course, that's important, but they never give any of the context behind what's happened. Now, a lot of Sudanese people are now starting to call this a counter-revolutionary war. What they mean by that is this war itself is actually a war to stop civilian rule ever coming into play in Sudan. Everyone remembers end of 2018, early 2019, we had a revolution. The revolution seemed to be very popular in the world. We saw people like Rihanna turning her Instagram profile picture blue. We saw, a lot of these videos on social media. Everyone was talking about Sudan. Here we are. What is it? 5 to 6 years later, and nobody's talking about Sudan. But essentially, what's happened with the revolution is the military dictatorship that's been empowering Sudan, not only for the 30 years of Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship, but essentially from when we gained independence in 1956. We had 3 very short spells of democracy. None of them lasted more than 5 years, and then back into another military dictatorship. Started with General Aboud, then the Mary, and then the final military dictatorship was Omar al-Bashir. Now, over the course of this long history of military dictatorships, the Sudanese army have monopolized all of the industries in Sudan. The agricultural industry, import, exports, the gold mines. We have huge gold mines in Sudan. The oil production, even though much of the oil went when South Sudan became independent in 2011. And when they had this attempt, this transitional government, which was meant to lead to civilian rule, one of the things, the transitional government, to be clear, was a bit useless. It was filled by, the civilian elites. It wasn't led by the resistance committees or the people that led the revolution. But one of the things that the transitional government tried to do is it tried to disentangle the Sudanese economy from the Sudanese military. And when it did that, that's when we had the coup that happened against Prime Minister Abdel Hamdok in 2021. And that's what laid the foundation for this conflict between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese army. Now, in Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces control the gold mines. And the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, General Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti, he's one of the richest men in Sudan because he controls the gold mines. And the rest of the industries are controlled by the army. Now, what some people have started to speculate online is that this conflict between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese army is in fact a fake conflict. What they mean by that is the Rapid Support Forces, the personnel is around 100,000. The Sudanese army, the personnel is around 150,000. 150,000. Yet there's been these battles that have been happening to recapture towns, but there's been no firefights. There's been no army casualties. There's been no Rapid Support Forces casualties. The only people that seem to die in this conflict are the Sudanese people. And both of these guys were friends. They fought together in Darfur. They fought together in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So many people outside of Sudan won't know that when Saudi Arabia basically invaded and bombed Yemen and created a humanitarian crisis there, the Saudi and the Emiratis never used their own foot soldiers to fight the Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis. They paid Sudanese army to send young men from Sudan to fight. So all the men that were coming back in body bags were Sudanese. So anyway, these men were fighting in Yemen together. Hemeti was controlling the Rapid Support Forces, and Burhan was controlling the Sudanese armed forces, and they were both fighting together. So these guys have got a long relationship. When Burhan took over the army, he made Hemeti the deputy leader of the Sovereign Council, again indicating that these guys have some sort of relationship. And then they've been fighting for a year, but it's unclear what they're fighting for. An army of 150,000 is unlikely to defeat an army of 100,000, especially in urban warfare. Both sides are too big to cancel out the other, especially in the type of fighting that they're doing. They're not fighting in open fields where, you just run up to each other with a sword and then you keep stabbing away and eventually there's no men left. So, it's a real sad tragedy for the Sudanese people, where they're stuck in between what appears to be a power struggle, but what many people are now speculating is actually an attempt to cause the Sudanese people to be so desperate that when these guys finally do decide to call a truce and come to some sort of agreement, nobody will ever talk about Sudanese civilian rule again. They'll say, forget civilian rule, we just want peace. You guys, if the army wants to continue controlling the agricultural industry, that's fine. If the Rapid Support Forces wants to continue controlling the gold mines, that's fine. All we want is peace and to be able to go back to our homes, and that's it. Forget democracy, forget rule of law, forget a more equitable system for the Sudanese people. Just peace will do.
Wow, that was a lot of information and really helpful to give that kind of insight. one of the questions I have for you as a follow-up to that is, how much do the people on the ground know about the players and their relationship? I mean, everything you just explained about them fighting in Yemen together, do the people know? Anytime I've seen a description like BBC Africa or anything, they'll say, here are the two players that are fighting in this war, right? They'll give you a description of one and a description of the other. They don't ever speak to their relationship. So do the people on the ground know?
The Sudanese people on the ground definitely know.
Okay.
And when I did 2 documentaries on Sudan called Unfinished Revolution Part 1 and Part 2 that came out in 2021, the people that I interviewed were cussing out Burhan and Hemeti. They saw them as indistinguishable figures from one another, 2 cheeks of the same backside. So the people on the ground definitely see these guys as a part and parcel of the military apparatus. Now, to provide extra context, the Rapid Support Forces was created by Omar al-Bashir for 2 reasons. Number one, to carry out the conflict in Darfur. So what happened was the Sudanese army, not just Bashir, but his predecessors, the dictators that preceded him, like Nameri, they realized that Sudan is a big country and they have no interest of developing the periphery regions. And when you neglect the periphery regions, the people from the periphery regions, the Nuba Mountains, South Sudan, Darfur, the Blue Nile, they're not going to accept their disenfranchisement. They're eventually going to say, no, hold on a second, we want a piece of this pie. So what Omar al-Bashir did and his predecessors before him, and what the British did before them, was classic divide and rule. They took so-called ethnic tensions between groups. So in Darfur, there was so-called nomadic Arab tribes, and there was the 4, which is considered Muslim but Black African tribes. And they started to have tension, which was exacerbated by climate change. With the desertification of the Sahel, places that were grazing grounds for one group now isn't as fertile grazing grounds anymore. So now they're encroaching on another group's piece of land. So what Bashir did was he took these, I guess, normal grievances that happen within periphery regions between groups, and he exacerbated them and played kind of ethnic divide and rule tactics, which culminated in the genocide that happened in 2003 to 2005 in Darfur. So that was the group was initially called the Janjaweed, which in Arabic means devil on horseback, and they basically defeated the people of Darfur, the 4 people of Darfur. But after they defeated the 4 people of Darfur, he then started to supply them, fund them more, to make his regime in Khartoum what they called coup-proof. So he thought, if I create this kind of super private army of 100,000 men, then nobody in the Sudanese army would ever do a coup against me. He didn't envision that they would join together, the private army and the Sudanese army would join together to do a coup and overthrow him. So that's kind of what led to Bashir's downfall. And that's kind of what people don't understand. They see as rapid support forces versus the army, not understanding the army created the rapid support forces. The rapid support forces are basically appendix of the army. So what's happening a lot right now, which is precisely the army's plan, is a lot of Sudanese people, especially young people, they're like, come on, the army, go defeat these rapid support forces. Yeah, Allahu Akbar. Yeah, they've defeated them here, they've defeated them there. And what some of us are saying, a bit older, I'm going to call myself a bit older than the rest of them, is that no, the army created this group. The army is responsible for everything that this group has done. The army is not the good guys in this conflict. And that actually speaks to why this hasn't got the media attention it deserves. You know, Israel-Palestine, for example. Do we have a settler colonial project oppressing the indigenous people of the land? Good versus evil. Yeah. Rwanda, Congo. More so recently, we have Kagami, who's backed by the West, exploiting his kind of resource-rich neighbor for the benefit of the West. Good versus bad, easy to understand. What people struggle with Sudan, and I get DM messages all the time. Who's the good guys? Who's the bad guys? You know, they've been conditioned through Hollywood in a way that we need, for us to take an interest in a conflict, we need a clearly defined good versus bad. If it's very bad versus evil, we just like, okay, that's too complicated. Let's kind of leave it alone.
That's really helpful. I think, you know, we've now gotten a lot of context for, you know, the history and where we are today. I'd like to next go into, you know, what can we do, right? What's happening on the ground right now, as well as what can potentially be done to help. But before I do, I don't know, Inem, do you have anything you want to add before we jump into that? I know we haven't got a chance to hear from you on this particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ahmed's last point is something that I was really thinking about in terms of the fact that the conflict in Sudan, I feel like it's so hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And I think it is because there isn't this like dynamic of like, okay, who do we root for here? And, you know, this kind of easily digestible, like, I mean, you know, kind of like Israel and Palestine, we can look at other histories and other situations and easily understand, okay, colonialism or settler colonialism and then the colonized. I think there's another piece that I also feel like I've heard people express like a difficulty in really understanding, or like another reason why I think this conflict doesn't get the same amount of international attention. And I think it's kind of what you're getting towards, Joe, like this question of how do people tap in. And so I've had this conversation with people before in terms of like, okay, to support the people of Palestine, we have this list of companies to boycott. And, you know, in terms of like the Democratic Republic of Congo, okay, so there's this movement where people are saying, okay, I'm going to purchase less electronics. I'm not going to upgrade my iPhone. And not to say that, you know, that's of course not how the BL end all in terms of what will liberate Palestine and the DRC. It takes, you know, a lot more than, and takes organization of the people on the ground, of course, and these, you know, international connections, solidarity, and then, you know, the ultimate goal, for example, of the struggle in Palestine is to get Israel to be sanctioned and other things like that. But I think in terms of like everyday people, they're really looking for something that they can do, like that kind of a consumer boycott to feel, I guess, like that, you know, I don't know. I think it's doing something in terms of generating a movement and like getting people, you know, around a certain issue. And so I guess, I don't know, like, what do you think? Like, is there something like that? I don't really see that there is, but I don't know.
Maybe.
But, I mean, you're wrong. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, both of the sides in the conflict, they're backed by multiple states, but the biggest backer of the Sudanese army is the Egyptians, and the biggest backer of the Rapid Support Forces is the United Arab Emirates. Both of those states are US client states. Both of those states, especially Egypt, relies heavily on military aid from the US. There has been no pressure applied. You know, there's been several reports of UAE shipment to the RSF being intercepted, clearly showing its origin being from the UAE. No repercussions, no repercussions. Nothing happens. There's been the Egyptian army, I think, receives the second biggest military aid budget behind Israel. It keeps funding the Sudanese army to carry on this war against the Rapid Support Forces. These guys will carry on fighting while they have a capability to fight. None of the weapons that they use are made in Sudan, so they're getting them from somewhere. It's a difficult one because, you know, I'm not for sanctioning any African state. I just don't think it's effective, and I don't think the US has the legitimacy to sanction. But pressure on their allies to stop sending weapons into the conflict, that is something that I think we can do on both sides. Like I said, there's no good side or bad side. There's no point telling the RSF, we're just going to take weapons away from you guys, because then that would just mean an imminent Sudanese army victory, and the RSF would never agree. There's no point saying to the RSF, to the Sudanese army, we're going to take weapons from the RSF because of the same reason. We need both sides to be de-armed. Otherwise, this conflict's just going to carry on. And these guys have shown they're willing to die. They're willing to fight, not to the last Sudanese soldier or to the last Rapid Support Forces soldier, but to the last Sudanese civilian. I'm glad you mentioned in your introduction that the figure of 13 to 15,000 is seriously underreported. It's so underreported, it's a joke. They say there's a massacre in Jenin in Darfur, which alone had 15,000 people killed. My father was trapped in RSF-controlled Bahri, which is North Khartoum, for 7.5 months. He didn't want to leave, and then eventually couldn't leave. But he said to me, there's no humanitarian organizations on the ground at all. So there's no one even to count the bodies. In Bahri, Khartoum, and Umdurman, which is what we call the tri-state capital, there are no humanitarian organizations at all. Nobody to count the bodies, nobody to provide aid. So, you know, I'm assuming your next question is how can we help? There is aid coming through via Chad, by the western frontier to Darfur. And, you know, that's obviously very helpful. And I think we put a link for the organization that's providing that aid. But honestly, for the people of the tri-state capital, the best way to help is to find Sudanese people who still have family there and get them to send money directly, and insist that the money obviously doesn't just go to help their said family members, but goes to help the community. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. And so on that note, what I'd love to do is maybe jump to another quick video before we send out that link to everyone to, obviously after the live is over, to check out and to see if there's different ways to help. But I thought we could play this video that, you know, goes to the heart of what's happening on the ground there. It's titled Sudan's Hunger Emergency. And let me run through a little bit of a background, and then we'll jump to the video. So the UN is warning that Sudan is on the brink of the world's largest hunger crisis. Agencies warn that hundreds of thousands of children and new mothers are likely going to experience loss of life. This suffering adds to the misery of a civil war that has had thousands experience loss of life, displaced millions, destroyed critical infrastructure, and unleashed genocide violence, all to massage the egos of 2 generals and their foreign backers. African Stream has teamed up with Sudanese activist Isidua Aldo to make this urgent appeal for more attention and action on the hunger crisis that is destroying Sudan's next generation. So let's jump to that video, which actually features Ahmed.
آمريني ايش تاكلون؟ هذا ايش هذا الجراد؟ ها؟ اشوف اعطيني جراد. هذا الجراد. ايه تشوفون الجراد ياكل لنا؟ ما حصلتوا اكل. ما حصلتوا الا الجراد. لا إله إلا الله يا ناس.
Heartbreaking and harrowing scenes of hunger and starvation affecting the displaced women in the Nuba Mountains, searching for anything to feed themselves and their children.
This video was filmed just a few days before Ramadan in Sudan. According to Save the Children, more than 2.9 million children are acutely malnourished in the country.
And more than 230,000 children and women are likely to die from hunger.
It doesn't take a war correspondent, a charity worker, or a nutritionist to convey what a painful death it is to die from starvation, and for what.
2 generals sacrificing the livelihood and the future of their people for power and foreign interest.
In short, Sudan is on the brink of the world's largest hunger crisis.
What started off as a rivalry over who will be the top man of the country has led to more than 8 million people fleeing their homes and over 13,000 recorded deaths. But the true number is likely to be much more than that.
Our dear Sudan, whose young people came and showed the world their revolutionary spirit just a few years ago, is now facing a humanitarian crisis of unparalleled proportions. Is it worth it, Burhan? Is it worth it, Hemeti? Who will feed our starving people? We now have to rely on handouts because of your greed.
Who will console our sisters, mothers and children who are in this position because of you and your foreign backers? The United Arab Emirates and Egypt, are you happy with what your men have done? You want our gold, iron, zinc, aluminium and ports, but you won't get them, and definitely not this way. So tell your henchmen to stop.
To the rest of the world, please don't forget about Sudan. We need your support now more than ever.
Speak up for Sudan. The fighting has to stop before it's too late.
So I think that was a very powerful message, speaking specifically to those folks who are directly involved. I mean, you had given a little bit of that insight prior to watching the video, but speaking to the folks of Egypt and the UAE and their foreign backers, right? Now, on top of that, I know that there is a link that you all had shared, and it's, I think, what is it, SudanCrisis.org /ways to help. So I think if we can put that in the chat for folks, if you guys are looking to help in any way, this is a resource for you to be able to look at the different ways to help, right? Figure out what makes the most sense for you if you'd like to get involved in some of the solutions. Separately from that, do you want to talk a little bit more to this call to action and why you guys did this video, Ahmed, and teaming up with this young lady as well?
Yeah, so Doha escaped Sudan and is now residing in Nairobi. And yeah, we've done many analytical videos about Sudan, who backs who, the origins of the crisis, etc. But we just thought, actually, you know, we're both Sudanese. I've lost family members to this war. She's lost family members to this war. All of our family is now displaced. The places that we've got pictures on our phones are now all destroyed. All of our memories are gone. So I was actually in two minds about this video because Inam will tell you when it comes to African Stream, even though we've clearly got an agenda, I'm always very adamant that we keep it as journalistically, sticking to journalistic principles as much as possible. This video deviated from that a little bit. It was more kind of like a personal, I'm not going to call it, for want of a better phrase, cry for help, just to let people know, you know, this is something that's real. It's not, you know, abstract or academic, it's real. And we just thought we'd deliver it in a way that was real. But something that we mentioned in the video that we haven't talked about so far is, I say these foreign backers, they want our ports. And I think something that is not discussed enough is obviously the Red Sea. And we're seeing increasing competition over the Red Sea. You know, both Egypt and the UAE, but it's not just them. There's Saudi Arabia. There's Russia had plans for its first ever naval base in Sudan, which obviously caused the condemnation of the United States. There's now increasing competition over the Red Sea, as with what we're seeing with Israel-Palestine and the actions of the Yemenis in blocking access to the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is going to be an increasingly hostile region in terms of the people that live there. If we look at the states that surround the Red Sea, we have Yemen, which has had conflict for the past 10 years. We've got Djibouti, which is home to the most military bases anywhere in the world, which has Japan's only military base, China's only military base, the United States' largest military base in Africa, France, a bunch of other countries that I'm probably forgetting. We have Eritrea, which is heavily attacked and sanctioned by the United States. We have now Ethiopia, which is engulfed in conflicts, not just one, but two, in the Amhara region and the Tigray. And obviously we have Egypt, which is, like I said previously, recipient of the largest military aid, aside from Israel. And then obviously, not to forget Palestine and what's going on there. So I think, you know, the reason why these foreign powers don't want to see democratic rule in Sudan is because democracy means unpredictability. You might get a nationalist leader that wants to nationalize these ports, that doesn't want to give up, you know, agricultural industries. One of the places that the Rapid Support Forces had control of, and now has just been taken over by the Sudanese army, is Al Jazeera State. Al Jazeera State in Sudan is the breadbasket of Sudan. It's where we export everything that comes from Sudan from. What reports are coming out from the farmers is that the Rapid Support Forces kicked out the farmers from their land. The rumors is that they kicked out the farmers for their land so that they could hope to eventually sell these fertile lands to Arab enterprises and states that would then begin to take over these places and begin to export from private farms to the rest of the world. So, you know, when you chip away at the causes of all these conflicts, it always comes down with strategic locations, resources, and you know, and making sure that the inconvenience of a civilian population is not going to get in your way.
Very well put. I mean, I think you've really encapsulated the issue, the players, the history, the current situation, and express your own personal experience, right? I think, which is really helpful for people to understand what that might be like for an individual who has close ties to the country and is from the country. Especially speaking to some of the comments earlier about folks having that direct experience. And the fact that you have an option too, which we put in the comments here for folks to help if they want. I know that you've given, you know, a ton of insight and a bunch of your time, so I appreciate you taking the time, Ahmed. I know that we, in the interest of time, I think we wanted to jump into the last two stories. But any final words before you go?
Final words, just, it's obviously there's the other conflicts in the world are super important, and I'm not going to be one of those people that says you should talk about Sudan, you shouldn't talk about these conflicts. Sudan is in Africa, you know, on African stream, we talk about the other conflicts. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But that being said, Sudan shouldn't be forgotten. You know, it's contributed so much to civilization. The Kingdom of Kush, you know, we have a King Tahaka who's referenced in the Bible. We have, you know, we taught the world about irrigation. It's a beautiful country with a beautiful history and beautiful people, and they shouldn't be forgotten. If you don't know that much about the conflict, that's understandable, but just extend your solidarity to any Sudanese person that you know. That would be my one message, because we really are going through it at the moment.
Well put, well put. Well, thank you, Ahmed, again for joining and giving the context and your own personal experience. Looking forward to having you back on to talk about other stories in the future.
Sure. You know, I could talk about other topics about Sudan. You don't have to kick me off for the next two videos. I'm here. I can stay on.
You want to stay on? Stay on. We'll jump into the last topic then of the day. And this one was one that is an ongoing conversation that we wanted to talk about. We didn't get a chance to get to it last live, but we did want to talk about it today. And that is on the topic of Gaddafi versus the West. So I think it might be good to kind of just roll right into those two stories. So I think the first one we want to do is actually Gaddafi's spokesperson basically said that the African Union could have helped save Libya in 2011. So his former spokesperson spoke to Africa Stream and told them in an exclusive interview he believes that African Union had the mechanisms necessary to prevent the overthrow of the Libyan leader by NATO in 2011, as well as the ensuing collapse of the state. I think it's Moussa Ibrahim told us that told African Stream that he personally lobbied to have the AU replace the UN Security Council in matters Libya, as well as for the use of African peacekeeping forces as opposed to the ruthless NATO bombing campaign. Ultimately, he says Africa was too weak back then. However, he also told African Stream that the reassertion of the Sahel sovereignty in recent years is cause for optimism. And he's noticed that fewer Africans buy the Western narrative about what happened in Libya these days. So I'd love to jump into this clip from the interview. The full version is on the YouTube channel from African Stream if you want to see the full version. But let's jump into this clip where you talk about it a little bit more with gentleman. And while we wait for that to queue up, in case there are any challenges there, maybe I can just give some insight into my personal experience with Libya while we work for that video to queue up. So we had a family member who had a house help who actually had, well, I'll get back to that story afterwards. So I think it ties right into the story, but the video is coming up.
Colonel Gaddafi was going for was basically a strong, unified African army. And in this particular instance, we've seen the failings of the AU, the weakness and cowardice of African leaders. Now, in the context of 2011, what options did African leaders like Museveni and Zuma have that could have prevented the devastation that we saw following NATO's destruction of Libya?
Again, using the mechanisms that were available, which is through the African Union. As a matter of fact, Libya officially, I spoke officially for the government asking for the African Union to intervene and for African peacekeeping forces to come to Libya instead of NATO's intervention, and for the African Union to supervise a Libyan national conference of dialogue that would include all Libyan parties, and we called upon African governments to be active in the scene and to replace the Security Council of the United Nations and the European countries. I think personally that some African leaders, like the leaders of Uganda and South Africa, Algeria, they did their part and they tried, but they were isolated. They were not able to gather momentum. I believe, for example, that today in 2024, the chances for Africa to act are bigger, and the revolutionary spirit in the continent is better. And if things would have happened today, I think Africa would have had a better chance to act. I salute the revolutionary spirit in the Sahel region, which did not exist at that time. And I salute the general awareness of Africans of the plotting and scheming of the West, which was a little bit on the weaker side in 2011. I remember personally that in 2012 and 13, I toured some African regions, and I did find many Africans to have been fooled by the propaganda of the West against Libya and Gaddafi. But now in 24, whenever I tour an African region, I find that the opposite is true. Most Africans are aware of the falsehood of the Western narrative, and they do believe that Gaddafi was a truly revolutionary and great leader. So I think things are looking better now, but we need to push forward. And you in African Stream are doing a great job.
really great endorsement of African Stream right there, African Stream at the end there, which I will concur, right? Because I've been following African Stream for some time now. So I had started to go into a story, and I'll turn it over to Inem because we haven't heard from her in a while. But just to give some context from my own personal experience as someone who was not very aware of what was happening in Libya at the time of the coup and the overthrow of Gaddafi, I was in the United States, and I was not fully aware. I was watching Western media, did not really know what was going on. I just heard overthrow the dictator seems to be normal. Even though at the time the United States said that we do not support regime change, although actively pursuing a regime change. But that to me, I was like, okay, that's just another thing that happens that the United States is involved in. Fast forward to probably about 2015, I got a call from a cousin of mine asking if I had any money to help support one of his former house workers who had been working in his house here in Sierra Leone. He had been told that through Libya, he could get to Europe. This was the pathway he was told that was a way to get to Europe. And so, he wasn't going to go through the formal channels of, applying for a visa or anything like that. He had been told, like many others, that Libya was the way to go. And we got a phone call, and he basically, they basically were extorting the family, right? And said, if you want to ever hear from him again, or you want to see him alive, you need to pay us $1,000. And the number kept going up the more that they refused. So they had, confiscated all his things, his cell phone, everything. And he had to communicate through them. They'd make the phone calls on his behalf. In the end, he did experience loss of life. We had stopped hearing from him, and we did find out later from the people that they were communicating with that they did do that. And I think that was the first time my eyes opened to the situation in Libya today after this regime change and what regime change can do to a country. So that was my own personal experience. I just thought it was important to put it out there because I don't know how many people know about what is happening there and how that is occurring in large numbers for folks. He described his conditions as like some kind of jail. He didn't have a metaphor or a simile or any other way to describe it. He had never seen anything like it. It was just scary, and of course it did end in him perishing. So I think as much as the West talks about how much of a dictator and the discussion of who Gaddafi was, they very rarely talk about exactly how what has happened since the United States and allies have kind of stepped in and contributed to the regime change. So I just wanted to throw that out there as my own personal experience, since I started the conversation before the video. But I'd love to turn it over to you, Inem, to speak to specifically like what your thoughts are on this interview and the topic in general.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I think what you just said is super important, which is the fact that after NATO intervened in Libya, I mean, it was just total collapse, right? I mean, it was this vacuum basically within the state. And Libya is, more or less been in a state of anarchy, and to some extent since that NATO intervention. And I think that one thing that people don't realize is that the destruction of Libya, the NATO destruction of Libya has had a huge impact outside of Libya's borders as well. It's a reason why, to at least to some extent, and I think it's some significant extent, why Burkina Faso is even at war right now against these paramilitary organizations, why Mali is fighting paramilitary organizations, why Niger is fighting these paramilitary organizations. After NATO intervened in Libya, certain like rebel groups who had ties to Mali were able to access the fallen Libyan government's weapon stash and bring those arms into the Sahel. And, with time that resulted in, just a crisis accumulating into the state that we are in now. And so I think, it's just, there's a lot of examples of this, of Western intervention, US intervention and NATO intervention leading to severe blowback and, spilling across borders and, impacting many different countries. And I think Libya is one of the best examples. And so I know to see how far Libya has fallen. You know, it was the wealthiest African country. It was the most prosperous African country. I believe it had the highest GDP per capita. You know, it had all sorts of social services, you know, maternal, you know, healthcare services, you know, education services. There is, at least to some extent, a distribution, state-covered distribution of electricity. To be in a state now, which is, you know, in the headlines constantly for things like slavery, you know, it's tragic. It's really sad, and I think it's also a lesson. You know, there's no, I can't think of any scenario in any sort of situation, regardless of who an African leader is, where the solution is, okay, NATO comes in and, you know, intervenes and overthrows the guy. I mean, I can't think of any answer. And all of the crises that we talk about on African Stream, I would never say, okay, the solution is that NATO has to come and swoop in here. And, you know, that's never going to be a save the day narrative ever. You know, it's always going to be something that is, at the end of the day, part of an imperialist project for their own material advances and gains. So, you know, I think Libya is a hard lesson. And a lot of Africans during the time around this era didn't have that clarity. I do know, you know, I'm aware that there were like different protests in different places of, you know, African people who were like cheering and saying, you know, down with Gaddafi and like supporting this sort of intervention. And I think it's like, if you go to a lot of these countries now where those that rhetoric is popular, it's like hindsight is always, you know, 50-50 or 20-20, sorry. You go there now and all of a sudden it's like you talk to people, and overwhelmingly I find that most African people in most countries that I go to miss Gaddafi, you know, and they're like, okay, well, things are better when Gaddafi was around. And that's how people feel in Burkina Faso. And, you know, when I've spent time in other countries, Ghana, Senegal, etc., people feel this way. So it's a lesson. It's sad. I don't even want to call it a lesson because it's like lives that are being lost and impacted. But I think it's a mistake that we cannot afford to make again. And so I think, you know, we have to be very clear on especially around this question of NATO and this question of intervention.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think as you know just mentioned, you know, I think that, as you said, hindsight is 20/20, and I think very many people, I mean, obviously Gaddafi was a polarizing figure. You can actually see it in the comments here. I mean, many people have many thoughts. But one thing I don't think any of us can dispute is Libya was much better off then than it is now. And not just Libya, but people traveling through and around Libya. And so with that, I'd love to hear from you, Ahmed, as well, since I know that you were, if I'm not mistaken, on that interview. And so what are your thoughts there? I mean, it seems as though, although it led to a very tragic experience, it also seems to have informed other people to not allow those kinds of interventions. So it almost seems as if what we're seeing with Sahel is actually a result of what happened in Libya. But what are your thoughts, having been a part of that interview and you know, that exclusive interview, let's say, and the years since the fall of Gaddafi?
I have so many thoughts on this topic. So firstly, something that doesn't get talked about enough is the role of the Western media in the regime change operation. So, and they perpetrated, I'm going to break them down into maybe 3 main lies, which they've all now accepted were not true. Lie number 1 was that Gaddafi's soldiers were taking Viagra and going around and raping women. Now, once Libya fell, once the Takfiri groups took over, there's still no evidence that ever happened. Lie number 2, which to me was what was potentially the most dangerous lie, and the lie that's caused the problem that we're still seeing today, is that they said Gaddafi had hired African mercenaries to come and fight for him. That lie directly contributed to the open slave markets that we saw in Tripoli. So once these groups took over, some of them read these Western reports and said, you guys were here to fight for Gaddafi. You know, to enslave people, as you and Inam know, you have to dehumanize them. So they thought, okay, you guys came here to fight for Gaddafi. Now we can treat you like cattle and put you in open slave markets. There's never been any apology, any compensation, anything by these groups, these Western media outlets that openly lied. Meanwhile, if they get Rupert Murdoch's name wrong in the paper, they have to pay compensation. But when you destroy a whole country through lies, nothing happens. That's point number one. Point number two, what's interesting about Libya is not only did it destabilize the Sahel, but it actually helped to destabilize the UK and France. So Manchester was the home of something called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. It was a Takfiri terrorist group that Gaddafi had kicked out in the 70s and 80s. They all went to the UK, Manchester, in exile, and they'd basically been congregating in Manchester. And the UK government would use them for destabilization projects in Libya. Now, when 2011 happened, the then British Home Secretary, Theresa May, who then would become British Prime Minister Theresa May, she gave these guys, who was a proscribed terrorist group, their passports and said, go liberate your country. Go liberate your country. Go overthrow Gaddafi. One of the generals, his son was a guy called Salman Abedi. Salman Abedi, our viewers might recognize the name. He's the guy that blew up the, what's the name? Aria Grande concert in Manchester. Yeah. So this radicalized young guy has gone to Libya, seen all sorts of death and destruction, come back to Manchester, strapped a bomb to his back, and blew up a concert which is full of children in one of the largest terrorist attacks that's ever happened in the UK. Now we constantly told that the West is the bastion of free press. How does the person that was paid a part in that decision then go on to become the Prime Minister without this ever being brought to her attention? Excuse me, Theresa May, why did you give these guys their passports when they're proscribed terrorist groups? Why did you let them go to Libya and travel back and forth freely between a war zone? So that, you know, and just something that was mentioned in the longer interview. Musa Ibrahim mentioned, he talks about the African response. He did say that Museveni and 6 other African leaders tried to go to Libya before the NATO intervention, and there was they were told in no uncertain terms they need to turn back. So what they planned to do was to go to Libya, try to negotiate with Gaddafi. Maybe if you step down, maybe if you leave the country, maybe if you agree to. Well, we don't know what they were planning to present. But before they even had a chance, they were told by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, African leaders were told to basically step down. If that's not, I don't even know if we can call that neo-colonialism. Isn't that just like classic colonialism? Is that like, that's not even like stealth neo-colonialism? That's like good old-fashioned, we own this country, you're not allowed to go over there. So of course there would have been a better African response now if it happened. But even back then, the limited attempts by African leaders were stopped in their tracks. And the final point I'll say on this, the way that it was reported on was one of the motivations for setting up African Stream, honestly. I was in Manchester at the time, where this, a lot of these kind of Libyan Islamic fighting groups were. I went to university in Manchester, and I just was losing my mind by things that were obviously not true, that were repeated constantly on the airwaves every single day, to the point where someone like, my mom, God bless her soul, she would say stuff like, yeah, but apparently he's doing this. I said, Mom, please turn off BBC News. That's not what's happening in Libya. So when obviously I'm not going to give us credit for this, but if you notice when Nigeria and ECOWAS were planning to attack Niger, on African stream, we were just in overdrive, absolutely in overdrive. We're not going to allow what happened back then, all of these kind of fake platitudes about democracy and democracy promotion to be used to completely destroy a state. And as Inam alluded to, when you destroy the state apparatus, you create a vacuum. When you destroy a state apparatus, we're not a fan of the police, but just put it into perspective. You destroy the army, you destroy the police, you destroy the social services, you destroy the hospital. It's like, for someone that's never been in that situation, it's unfathomable the kind of how difficult it is to recover from that. And here we are in 2024, Libya is divided between rival governments, and it doesn't look like it's recovered until now. And, whatever small part we played, and I know it was a small part that we did play, and other media outlets did play in preventing that happening in Niger, that's the purpose of African Stream. That's the purpose of Authentic African. That's the purpose of Burkina Books, of the Thomas Sankara Center. That's the purpose of all Pan-Africans everywhere. We now have things at our disposal that our predecessors didn't have, and we've got to use it to basically participate in this propaganda war, essentially.
Well put. And I know we're a bit over time, but the story is so important and people still seem very engaged. What I want to do is get to the last element of this, which I think is interesting. And it's entitled How the West Betrayed Gaddafi. So while the West obviously have and currently vilify him now, it once welcomed Libya's revolutionary leader, Muammar Gaddafi, as he relates in the 2011 ABC News interview, just weeks before the fateful NATO intervention that brought disaster on his country and, of course, on himself. He candidly explained why he felt betrayed as an international community became openly hostile. So Libya's relationship with the West improved throughout the 2000s. The North African country was viewed as a bulwark against jihadist extremists and illegal migration. But when the Arab Spring swept the region, beginning in December 2010, President Obama turned against Gaddafi, claiming he was hell-bent on murdering thousands of pro-democracy protesters. From reaching a political settlement with Britain and the US and compensating bombing victims to being invaded, apologies. Illegal migration. But when the Arab Spring swept the region beginning in December 2010, President Obama turned on Gaddafi, claiming he was hell-bent on murdering thousands of pro-democracy protesters. From reaching a political settlement with Britain and the US and compensating bombing victims to being invaded by the NATO-led coalition, Gaddafi's relations with the West went full circle. It all ended on October 20th, 2011, when he experienced loss of life by rebels in the city in Libya. So now I think the question is, do you agree that Gaddafi was betrayed? Let's watch this video quickly that describes this a bit more in detail.
Gaddafi was brought in from the cold several years ago after giving up his weapons of mass destruction. The United States and other countries lifted sanctions and started doing business with Gaddafi again. Do you feel betrayed by the United States? How do you account for how they are towards you now today?
Of course, it's a betrayal, a big betrayal. And there are no manners, it's silliness, beyond silliness, that the world can base their decisions on media reports. Is it possible that the world's decisions are being based on these reports? Political decisions. They should be looking for the truth of what is happening on the ground in Libya, then make their decisions.
We asked him what he thought of President Obama.
My opinion I've said before on many occasions. I believe he was a good young man. I supported his international policies, and the relationship between the two countries has changed. But it seems he's been misinformed, and I can't believe the statements he has made.
He said he thought outside powers wanted to recolonize Libya, and he vowed to fight off any invaders alongside the Libyan people.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see how in many occasions, the United States was once friendly with an individual, and when they spoke out about specific things, that changed. I think the same for Saddam Hussein, as you guys might everyone watching may know or may be familiar with. There are many leaders where the U.S. Were friendly with them and traded with them and were happy with them until they weren't, and then supported regime change. So on that note, Inem, let me come back to you on this one, because I think this is an interesting element to this discussion, right? It hadn't always been adversarial, and at one point there was a friendly relationship and opening up of trade at one point in time, and then it did sour and obviously change the trajectory of Africa forever. What are your thoughts here on this particular topic of the change and eventually leading to the what became a regime change?
I mean, I think what's interesting regarding this particular video, as well as like their whole discussion, is that we don't really have to speculate so much about, you know, what was, you know, the West's problem with Gaddafi. You know, why didn't they like the guy? Why did they turn against the guy? A lot of that information has been leaked. At least parts of that information have been leaked. I mean, Hillary Clinton's emails have been leaked. We know now more factually with that evidence what the issue was, and at a certain point, you know, as this was happening, a lot of it actually was about Pan-Africanism. You know, this objective that we're fighting for and that we're talking about on our platform. Gaddafi was too ambitious with his aims of unifying the African continent in their eyes. There was all this talk of a Pan-African currency for the entire continent to be backed by Libya's gold. That's unacceptable for the West. And I think about that, from a place like Burkina Faso, where we're still having these conversations right now about the CFA franc and trying to move out of that at this point, and looking towards like a new currency, and just thinking about how there's 13 other countries in Africa that don't have any form of monetary sovereignty and that are using the CFA franc. So this is by design. It also makes me think about how, we talk about how so few African leaders really defended Gaddafi or really, stuck up to NATO during this time. And to me, it's just not a coincidence when you look at the reality where it's like we have so many African leaders that are, we have the CFA franc still in place. There are many African leaders that answer to France, that answer to the US, that answer to the West. And so I think Gaddafi was putting out some very, very radical, very advanced ideas and things that we're still fighting for right now. He spoke openly on many occasions about this idea of creating a United States of Africa, a unified African continent. And so I think the currency aspect was like supposed to be one of his, one of the initial pushes towards that aim. And it would have been way too costly for the West sort of global economic power, an actual African currency that could compete with the dollar and compete with the euro, would have changed history. The other thing I'm thinking of, and just in terms of like this moment leading up to and then after Gaddafi is overthrown and killed, is just the way racism was used as this tactic against Gaddafi and the Libyan people. And I don't know, I just think about the way that Gaddafi is depicted in Western media. And it's just like, he was just like this buffoon, like this like nutcase. And I think of movies that are coming out around this time, like The Dictator, and just the way, we have this like super backwards, strange guy. I mean, I feel like they always depicted him, and still to this day, depict him as this very like strange man that had no sort of cohesive, real ideology or thought process or whatever. And, you know, I encourage people, honestly, to just read the Green Book. I don't agree with everything that he writes in it. I don't. But, like, there's things that I do agree with that are written in there. And I think that if you read it, you'll realize, okay, the guy had, you know, he had a...
Joe, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, I think we lost Edem, the connection.
Okay.
Yeah, if you'd like to pick up where she left off, and just in terms of your thoughts, and we can bring back in to kind of complete her thought. Oh, she's back. I think you're back.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I was just wrapping up. But yeah, just read him. Come to your own conclusion. You know, just look into some of what he was actually pushing for and what he was actually saying, and, you know, think for yourself in terms of, you know, is he just this really crazy lunatic type of guy?
Well put. And then, of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Ahmed, on this topic. I mean, you've spoken at length earlier, but just in terms of the flip-flopping and then the regime change, I think that's a very interesting. It's an interesting pattern that we've seen at other times in history with the United States, and this is no different. But, you know, love to hear your thoughts on this one in particular.
Sure. Just for the sake of clarity, his situation is very different to Saddam Hussein, in a sense of Saddam Hussein started off as a CIA asset, was told the US that he was going to invade Kuwait. The US said, we don't have a dog in the fight. And then when he invaded Kuwait, that's when they turned against him. But with Gaddafi, he has never been what I'd consider a US ally. What happened was he was, you know, when he came through the Jamahiriya revolution in, I think it's 69, there was hostility all the way for many decades. And then in 2003, when Saddam Hussein was overthrown, many of these leaders thought, you know, we don't want to be next. So according to Dr. Musa Ibrahim, he says the reason why he went for rapprochement with the West is so that he could push through these revolutionary programs, the gold dinar, the African satellite, you know, beefing up the African Union so it actually has some real teeth. So he said he went for rapprochement for the West so that he could push these things. And he thought that, you know, he would get further if he was in the good books with the West. But what the West actually did was it got Muammar Gaddafi to disarm. So he made sure that he gave up his nuclear weapons. And much like the mafia does, you know, the mafia doesn't make videos dissing you saying, you know, like some Tupac Biggie kind of stuff. They appear with smiles, give you kisses on the cheeks. They'll have some pasta. And before you know it, there's one in the head. And I think that's kind of a metaphor to what happened with Muammar Gaddafi. They were like, they shook hands with him. Tony Blair was shaking hands with him on the Sahara Desert. He met up with Obama. They took pictures together. It looked like everything was cool. As soon as he's disarmed, boom, comes the regime change operation, which was their plan all along. Something I mentioned earlier, I said there were 3 lies. The third one just came to me. One of the things that the Western media, because Gaddafi mentioned it in the video, so it reminds me, one of the things that they said, whenever there's these kind of regime change operations, I don't know if you notice, they seem to get biblical. So right now in Gaza, we have 40 beheaded babies. At the time in Libya, they said that Gaddafi had instructed his men to go door to door and kill all of the male children, which is obviously reminiscent of the story of I think it was the plagues of Egypt, where, you know, the angel Gabriel goes to each door and kills the firstborn son. So they went biblical with the lies when it came to Gaddafi, and the Western media just gobbled it up. Didn't even verify, because considering Gaddafi speaking Arabic, a very easy language to translate, you know, there's many Arabic speakers that you could find that could verify that this is not what he said. And yeah, they ran with it. And another part of the same interview, Gaddafi mentions Al Qaeda and how he put Osama bin Laden on a watch list, on a terrorist watch list, way before the West did. So if they were really ever interested in fighting terrorism, Gaddafi would have been seen as a natural ally, but he wasn't. It was considered an enemy. They armed terrorists to overthrow him, and now the Sahel has the highest concentration of terrorist groups of any other place in the planet. So yeah, that's the legacy of the NATO regime change operation.
All great insight and information, and I appreciate the correction on the differences between the relationship with the U.S. and Saddam Hussein in the U.S. and Gaddafi. I think there are very different circumstances, similar outcomes, different circumstances. On that note, this obviously has been a information-packed live. I learned a lot, and I hope that the audience did as well. I want to thank you again, Ahmed, for joining us on this live. And of course, we're looking forward to having you join in the future. And also, Inem, also thank you very much for joining. For those of you who are watching, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe to the Authentic African channel and also African Stream. We are on all platforms. So, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. So make sure you follow us on all the platforms. We will generally be going live on Mondays at 3 p.m. GMT. That is the plan moving forward. But on some occasions, like today, we may have to go live on a separate day. But our goal is to do this weekly so that we can tell you the stories from around the world, give you some additional context, and sometimes some insight from people who have been directly impacted from those stories. On that, I guess I want to open it up to YouTube for any final comments before we go. Let me start with you, Ahmed, and I'll end with Inem.
Just in the first half of the show with Joe, they gave you perspectives and analysis that you haven't heard probably ever on the mainstream media. And all I would urge everyone to do is keep going to alternative sources for your information. Like I said earlier, the reason why the Libya war was able to get consent and there was no mass demonstrations that were happening like there was against Iraq is because the Western media, their propaganda was so effective, it was so unchallenged that people were basically led to believe that this is a fight of good versus evil. Gaddafi's evil. We're going to kill him. What does Hillary Clinton say? We came, we saw, he died. And then everything's going to be great for the Libyan people. Now, because of the advent of the internet, or the internet was around at the time, but because of how the internet and information is spread, there's so many places to find alternative sources of information. The Western mainstream media no longer has a monopoly on information or monopoly on lies. So please, not just when it comes to issues relating to Africa, when it comes to issues relating to Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, anywhere, please, please, please do continue to look for alternative sources of information.
Well put. Inem, any final words?
I guess just to say, I think this comes up more or less in every episode we've done, but just to understand that Western NATO intervention is never an answer to any of these crises that we've talked about in Africa throughout this episode. And it is the imperialist system that's at the root of all of these different conflicts that we're always touching on. And also to say the episode, yes, to look up that episode, the clip we showed of Muammar Gaddafi's former spokesperson is from an episode of Pan-African Attitude, which is a podcast on the African Stream YouTube channel. And to look that episode up, you get a lot more information directly from his former spokesperson. And I think it's just a very powerful episode, and it dispels a lot of myths and just gives a very different perspective on Gaddafi than what a lot of people might hear otherwise in mainstream platforms.
Awesome, thanks for that. And we'll add those to the description as well, just to make it easier with click and to take you over to those videos. And so with that, guys, thank you all for watching. We appreciate you all joining and engaging in the discussion. We can't always get to all of your comments, so we try to address them as much as we can as we go along. We will continue to be bringing this information. As Ahmed said, pay attention to independent media, folks that are not, beholden to specific corporations that have an agenda, right? We'll put it that way. And so with that, thanks all for watching. We will see you all next week.